There we go.
All right. Hi, my name is Joyce Ogola.
I'm June Lindroth.
I'm Logan Martin.
Oh, yeah, I'm Wesley.
Okay.
Okay, who wants to read their 250 words first?
Or I think today it was two discussion questions with quotes, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought we were doing both, but that's fine.
I can go first. My first question was, given the executive order authorized the forced removal of Japanese Americans solely based on ancestry, stripping their right without any trial or charge. How do we reconcile the fact that the United States simultaneously presented itself fighting a war against racial tyranny and then deployed its most devastating weapon against the Japanese civilian population? One supporting quotation is, he felt the presence of a process as yet dimly seen in which nature of human life on this planet was undergoing a change. Leighton closes on a note of civilianizational reckoning, and the other question is whether Americans could honestly hold that reckoning while their own government had just years before locked up citizens for looking like the enemy.
Um, I think that it is like very contradictory to from like what we tried to move away from. And I think it's interesting. This kind of goes kind of towards my question, but it's like where is the line drawn with like um kind of use like fear mongering and saying like, oh, this is like for national security and like, and then like there were no, I think there's a quote where it's the executive order was like very vague and gave
Mhm.
like limits almost to what needed to be like happen. Um, I would say for from which any or all persons may be excluded. Um, so I think it was just kind of it's just interesting to see like give an inch, take a mile kind of thing. It's very cruel um, sort of mindset
You know,
that everyone was in.
Yeah, I think that the attack on, the Pearl Harbor sent a panic across the American public and government. And
Mhm.
obviously, like they want to stop any form of like potential espionage that will cause like another event like this, right? But
Mhm.
I do think it's like a bit extreme that they forced all the Japanese Americans to go to the different camps with only like a day's notice.
Mhm.
It's sort of that question of at what point do you stop trading security for freedom or freedom for security? Um, it's like that quote goes, uh, "Your freedom stops where my rights start." Right, where once you start encroaching on another person's rights, your ability to do something should, in essence, stop. Um, and we have, and it was wrong in the time, but we absolutely have hindsight too to look back and say, hey, we should not have done that.
kind of like building off of what June said, like where that fine line is. I think they purposely made the line ambiguous because if they made a for sure what is like infringing on people's rights too much, that would hold them accountable. It kind of relates to some of the questions that I wrote, but I think they purposely made it so that they could push the boundaries slowly and slowly to where the line becomes really ambiguous.
Yeah. Also, like they like made it extremely ambiguous. Also, given the fact that like not every single Japanese American, obviously Japanese American, right? Like not all of them were still immigrants. 2/3 of them were citizens. And even when like after the government like formally apologized, I don't think they like returned any of the things that they lost, like any potential business that they could have had, you know, farm, land, property, like any of that, right? They just gave them more civil rights, but the physical compensation wasn't there uh to be provided.
Mm. What was your second question, Leslie?
Yeah, my second question was that uh the the readings describe the bombs, the destruction in terms of the suffering that crossed all boundaries. This includes soldier and civilian, man and child, while the first reading treated an entire ethnic group as a collective security threat. Do the two documents together reveal something permanent about how the United States defined who is and who is not a legal subject of its moral concern? And a supporting quote would be um, they were burned and broken structures, stretches of flat rubber here and there. There is a remnant wall or twisted iron. The physical landscape described is one of total erasure. All of the ordinary human lives within it simply removed. And the echo of the removal of 1966 order is difficult to ignore.
I think it's really easy when you're so far removed from experiencing the damage that you have done. Like, we're thousands of miles away from Japan. So most citizens here were able to kind of remove themselves from who they were actually affecting, um, and kind of justify it with, oh, well, they attacked us at Pearl Harbor, and um, it's all of their fault. We're not like they were able to remove themselves and kind of take them out of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really easy for people to do that when they're not seeing what is happening.
Kind of like what you said, them detaching because they're so far away. I think also like because everyone in America, like because we're all so like they were all detached and they all have very like-minded like viewpoints. It's easy just to kind of bounce off each other, and realizing it becomes easier after a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of that victim mentality where um, it's easier to be angry about something that's been done to you than your own actions. Um, of course, every American will be mad about Pearl Harbor, but not every American can relate to that suffering that occurs as a result of the firebombing campaigns or internment or the nuclear bombs being dropped. But every American can probably in some way relate to the pain of the attack of Pearl Harbor, even though that's 2,000 casualties on the scale of a couple 100,000 in the low millions for the civilian casualties of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Logan, do you want to go next for questions, or I can? Or
I can. My first question was, does American democracy force us to question our actions during wartime more so than other nations? Um, the first thing I wanted to build off of is a quote from Executive Order 9066, where it says that it's the opening statement where he says, I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War, the military commanders for whom he may designate, and any commander who gets designated as well to prescribe military duties, which that's in my mind a big encroachment on freedoms because these are none of those people are in positions that are elected by the citizenship. Those are all people that have either come up through the military and that's their career, or in the case of the Secretary of War, is an appointee by the president. So these are people that are not elected but are still being given huge authority to control the lives of everyday Americans. And then I also wanted to build on that, that question of, do we have to question our actions, by with a quote from that day at Hiroshima by saying, more than a third of the city's land was taken up by military installations, and then later on it says, during the war there was an increase in industrialization and plants grew up, chiefly in the outskirts. So we, in a way, we can look at Hiroshima at the time as a military target because, like I said, it's a third military installation, but at the same time, we have hindsight to look back and say we hit the city center and we really didn't touch the military industry. So, my question is more so broadly tying back all into that. Does American freedom make us question these things more so than other nations would?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that during wartime, specifically, actually, sorry, I need a second to think about this. If somebody else wants to go first.
I'm also trying to gather my thoughts. I feel like we've kind of touched on this, like I think that we do try to justify it in like keeping our national security. We justify our actions. Like I feel like in history classes previously, I've never really tested the morality of like what we have done in the past. And I do think that the United States is like has justified our actions more than most.
I think the bombing is like quite interesting though, because at the time, Japan was like on the brink of surrender. Even with like the fire bombings, it had killed like more or like around the same um as like the atomic bomb, and also the naval blockade combined with the Soviet entry into the Pacific War also caused the Japanese to be more like have less morale, and they also hinted at wanting to surrender before the atomic bomb. And like one question that like or one thing that stood out to me is like if the bombing was like even necessary, right? It's like
Yeah.
it was like targeted towards civilians and not any military base or like military target.
I think at that point, it was not even necessary. They were trying to make a statement because obviously we all know that America could have still won without something to that scale at all. But I think they were trying to set like maybe like a precedent for other people in the future. Like if you mess with us, this is what happens. But kind of like June said, I don't think that is moral at all. Killing hundreds of thousands of people just to make a statement is not protection or freedom at that point. That goes into a different category now.
Just real quick before I move on to my next question, I just wanted to say one thing on that. Personally, I think that the atomic bombings were, as terrible as they were, I think they were the correct choice because we know for sure they did end the war. But also, I think going on later, that sets a precedent where people have seen the destruction of atomic weapons. And in my mind, I don't know that later on in Korea, when MacArthur tried suggesting we drop 50 nuclear bombs on Korea and China, I don't know that the opposition to him would have been so staunch. But moving on to that second question, should a wartime decision be judged primarily by the suffering it causes in the moment, or should it be judged by the lives it was thought to save in the long run? And another quote from Executive Order 9066, Whereas the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and sabotage to national defense material, and then it references a act passed in 1918, which I wanted to look that up to figure out what that was, and that act of April 20, 1918 was the Sabotage Act of 1918, which made it a felony offense to sabotage anything that goes against the war effort. Um, I also had a quote from that day of Hiroshima where it says, "It is not certain how many the bomb killed, but the best estimate is from 70,000 to 80,000." And then, of course, that end quote where it says, "If there are such thing as ghosts, why don't they haunt Americans?" And just tying everything back together, um, tying wartime decisions back into the things that they were thinking they were going to prevent versus the suffering they caused. Um, Executive Order 9066 was not just passed because we wanted to endure Japanese American. I mean, there was a very prevalent fear of Japanese Americans. Now, whether that fear was justified, that's a different question. But there was absolutely a fear amongst Americans that there was this fifth column that was going to try and sabotage the country and impact the war effort. And it does build off that 1918 precedent from World War One, where there were saboteurs, domestic saboteurs, not foreign, domestic, acting against the war effort. But then you also have to weigh that against the 70 to 80,000 lives that were lost as a result of the nuclear bombs, whether or not they were, well, that's just Hiroshima, but um, whether or not their lives were worth ending that war.
To kind of answer your original question, I think both need to be considered the lives of people at the current of the war plus in the future, but I think there needs to be a little bit more emphasis on the bigger picture because I feel like this is more like, I guess, anecdotal with different types of wars evidence, but so many times we look back and looking in hindsight, we see the damage that something caused, but we only see that typically 10, 20, 30 years later. I think it would be beneficial going forward for us to look at things more in the big picture because I feel like in times saying Americans, just other people acting out of fear only helps in the short run for so long.
Hmm. I think that it's like quite interesting because there's two sides to the coin. Like America, if they weren't gonna use bombs, they were just gonna attack via land. And it was obviously, if you think of like the number of lives saved, it would have saved like many American lives, and maybe the impact of like a land attack wouldn't be as heavy as like a atomic bomb. But then also at the same time, like the whole reason that they decided to bomb them was to set like this precedence that Logan talked about, and also to um hold a larger part or have a bigger role in the Pacific settlement, because if they bomb them and destroy their morale, the United States comes in and like helps rebuild the land, helps rebuild the infrastructure. So from like a geopolitical stance, like this is the correct thing to do. But morality wise, it's probably not so much.
Mhm. I think that it is interesting to like think about it that way is like having to be that person that's deciding like is this worth the lives we're going to lose now, or what do we think is going to happen in the future? How many lives do we think we're going to lose later if we don't do this? um I mean, I feel privileged to never have to be the one making that sort of decision. I can't imagine um kind of what goes into that. It's an interesting place to put yourself, I feel like.
And if I could just say one more quick thing before we move on, I'm a World War II nut, so this conversation is as good as it gets to me. Um, in rebuttal to what Wesley said about a potential ground invasion of Japan, um, this was the first war where we had televised reels and news reels going into every home. Um, and it was front page news across the entire country what was going on in the Pacific. And now the lectures don't talk about battlefield antics or whatever, but every American home had seen the casualty reports from battles like Guadalcanal, Palau, Iwo Jima, and those were very, very bloody battles that I'm sure most Americans would agree that we did not want something on an even larger scale of the actual homeland of Japan.
Mm-hmm. I can go ahead and read my questions. I feel like we've kind of answered them, so if we don't spend as much time on them, that's okay. But my first question is, does the suffering described in Hiroshima justify questioning whether like any military objective is worth like that cost? Kind of gearing towards like what's happening now, or like what might happen in the future, like kind of where is that line? Um, a quote I pulled from the day at Hiroshima. It's like the doctor at the hospital said, quote, the most pathetic cases were the small children looking for their parents. It's just like the loss that was caused by such a tragic event, and that not just the atomic bombs, but really any military objective. Um, is it worth the civilian cost? I feel like we've kind of already touched on this, but maybe if we could pull from like what's happening now, like I don't know.
If you're pulling from like modern day, like things that have happened recently, I think the civilian costs need to be weighed very carefully because, I mean, there are many scenarios where the government of a country is not in line with like the people. So if the government are doing actions that start to directly affect the citizens and the civilians, whether it's like they don't have food now, a lot of the children are dying, I think that lowers morale, and in turn that will make less people want to fight. That'll just like lower morale in a country, will actually negatively affect the war effort. So I think thinking in terms of the civilians isn't something that always takes away from war effort. Long term, it could be beneficial if more political leaders took that into account.
I think the bombing is like an example of like, having either like everything happen at once or like having a slow burn, right? Like the battle in Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed that the Japanese would like the Japanese would like fight until their population has dwindled probably to the same, if not more, than the Japanese bombing. So yeah, and also like maybe Hiroshima could have been a military target in the sense that it was the headquarters of the Japanese Second Army,
Mhm.
and they were responsible for defending the entire southern half of Japan, right? And that's where America would have landed first if they had a land attack. And it was also a major hub and supply,
Yes.
major port and supply hub. So, yeah.
And just to build off that a little bit, it gets mentioned a little bit in that day at Hiroshima, but that port is where the Japanese army um, conducted their troop movements into the rest of Asia. And, China kind of gets forgotten in the grand scheme of World War II, but they had pretty much the worst civilian losses of almost any nation. So, I mean, and they were on the back foot, but Hiroshima can absolutely be viewed as a military target. There was military industry, there was the military headquarters, and it's a port city. Um, Now, weighing that against the civilian loss, which we now know that we didn't necessarily hit as much of a military target, we hit the historic city center. You know, that day at Hiroshima really goes into talking about that feudal castle that exists at the city center and how that had been there for thousands of years and it was just sort of destroyed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
June, do you want to see your second?
Yeah, I can say my second question. We've kind of already also touched on this. But is it ever justified for a government to take away an individual's rights if national security is at risk? A quote I pulled from the executive order, is the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage. And I just highlight where it says every possible. And again, there is very vague. I think we've already talked about this. Kind of leaving it up to the discretion of the people of authority, kind of. But I kind of guess I'm wondering, like, where's that line where national security is more important than that of civilians' rights, citizens' rights?
In the sense of the camp, um, the camp, or like the first part of the reading, I think that this is like a more like a trolley problem. Like if there was a lot of espionage attack or like potential terrorism attacks from Japanese civilians, I feel like saving the lives of others compared to like not preventing that is much better in a sense. I think it's the way you treat your like the way you have to like make up to the people that uh were just victims of the situation, and also ensuring that conditions are right as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the exact wording, you, the question I think you had said was, is it ever justifiable to take those rights? Um, and I don't really think so. No, I know we did it in the interest of national security, but everybody knows inalienable human rights. That
Yeah.
our government is laid out on the concept that these rights are not given by government. These rights are given by being a United States citizen. They
I
are
agree.
not. These rights are not something that can be taken or should be taken. They are rights,
Mhm.
and the fact that this went to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court ruled that we were allowed to do this is just absolutely absurd to me.
I agree.
What about all the what about the third of the people who were at the camps that were not American citizens? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, in that case, it moves towards a gray area, but I also still think that's not. I I feel like the United States has a higher standard than other places in the world, where we lay out this groundwork of inalienable rights for our citizens, and I feel like people within our country should be granted a similar standard.
Yeah, I do agree with that, but if we're like for like citizens, right? But then it's like maybe it's not right to talk about it in this
Mm-hmm.
conversation, like drag it on, but I think um yeah, it's definitely worth debating
Yeah, it's
over.
absolutely a gray area.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, do you think I could share the two questions that I have?
Yeah.
We kind of already have touched on it just by this conversation, but my first question was by intentionally omitting any mention of Japanese in the executive order, how did the US government create a legal loophole that allowed for state sanctioned racism while claiming to be objective? And some of these quotes we've already talked about, but one that we haven't was this quote. It was the designation of military areas in any region or locality shall supersede designations of prohibited and restricted areas by the Attorney General. So with this, it's like they're basically overruling the Attorney General and no judge can actually stop stop the military. And I think this kind of like we're talking about like the fine line. They like you can see them slowly trying to create this loophole that people aren't realizing how bad it might get. And it could have even gotten worse from this if this thing had kept its precedent.
Yeah, I think the loophole is ultimately created by the vagueness and not explicitly saying one race or one group of people. Like that's the loophole was created, I think, from the very beginning. Um But yeah.
Mhm. And my second question was, in what ways did the executive order frame the removal of families into these camps as a logistical operation to normalize the violation of their human rights? And there's like two different parts where I see it. It's like this one quote, and we've talked about this, and it starts with "I hereby further authorize," and then the rest of the sentence goes to saying, including the furnishing of medical aid, hospitalization, food, clothing, transportation, use of land, shelter, other supplies, equipment, utilities, facilities, and services. And the way I was just looking more so at the language used, the way they kind of list everything out, it almost makes like when you first read it, if you don't have a lot of context, it's like, oh, this is fine. Like they have food, water, transportation, clothing, like they're all set. It kind of makes it seem normal, like, oh, we're giving them this normal life, when in reality, we actually are taking away their rights. It's not just, oh, we're placing them somewhere else, like we are doing something wrong, but it's phrased in a way that is able to be seen as not that.
I mean, it flies directly in the face of the Fourth Amendment to me, where that's an unwarranted search and seizure. But I mean, the executive order, I guess, it tries to lay out a defense against that because it sets precedent calling upon the Sabotage Act of 1918. But the fact that it gives all that power to unelected bureaucrats and military, it's just I tried thinking of a way to justify it, to play devil's advocate for it, but I just can't do it.
Yeah. Well, does anyone have anything else to add? I think we've gone about 10 minutes over our time, but
Oh.
Yeah, I believe that should be everything. Yeah, that should be everything.
Okay.
all right. Good to speak with you guys this week. See you again next week.
Yes.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
recording off here.
We have like 4 in total.